Hi, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. I sure appreciate you all joining me. Let me introduce myself. I'm Joel McIntosh. I'm the publisher at Prufrock Press. Little bit of background. I started out as a teacher in gifted education, and I left teaching after a few years to join Dr. Susan Johnson at Baylor University to coordinate, well, for partially do my graduate work in gifted education, but also to coordinate a Javits grant there at Baylor. And then after my time at Baylor, I started Prufrock Press, and I've been running Proofrock for 30 years. So I dedicated to this field, dedicated to helping you guys do what you do. Before I start into the presentation, I want to mention that I'm going to be a bit of a proxy for some very smart people out there. When I talk about the SCRIPSIS, the scales for rating the behavioral characteristics of superior students, I'm really talking about a creation that Dr. Joe Renzuli developed. When I talk about SIGs, Dr. Gail Reiser, Kathleen McConnell, and when I talk about the HOPE, I'm going to be talking about a product that Marcia Gentry and her team did at Purdue. So I'm going to, as I say, I'm going to be the less intelligent proxy for some very smart and talented people as I talk about these behavior rating scales. And you know, please understand the creative work here and the scholarship is on the part of others. I was looking through the attendee list, and I'm excited. This is a new group of people. I haven't met you guys. I hope that when we're all able next year to get to a conference and see each other, we'll be able to introduce each other and speak face to face. I miss the interaction, so hopefully next year we'll all be able to get back together. I would like to mention a couple of things. One is there's two areas where you can ask me questions, and I think Mark Twain said it's a terrible death to be talked to death. So if you'd like to add some questions and see if you can get a little bit of information from your perspective that you'd like to have, please feel free to use either the chat box or the Q&A box down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'll take a little time at the end of the session to address your questions, and as best I can, and if I can't, I'll refer you to some of the folks who can. But please feel free to use that Q&A box and the chat box to keep things interesting. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to screen share my presentation, and I'm afraid the first part of this presentation is going to be a little heavy on the slideshow approach, but I think there's a lot of information I want to get across here. So I'm going to start talking about the general topic of this presentation is equitable identification, or at least towards equitable identification of using behavior rating scales. And I want to first establish what a behavior rating scale is. And before I do that, let me tell you that what I'll first do in this presentation is talk to, what are behavior rating scales? What's the rationale for using behavior rating scales? Why are they so effective at achieving or moving towards equity in gifted programs? And then I'll talk about some of the specific instruments that we offer at Prufrock Press. And I'll also demonstrate a little bit regarding the online scales. But first, let me just stop for a second and talk about what are behavior rating scales. These guys have been used, they're probably one of the oldest assessment tools in mental health education and research. The example that anybody who's a parent has seen this example. This is from the CDC. It's your baby at 2 months. So this is, notice that we've got behaviors listed. So these are, now in this case, we don't have a Likert scale. We're not rating the degree to which the child exhibits it's 1 through 5. We're just identifying whether they exhibit it at all. But each of these items are discrete behaviors that a parent can see that their baby either does or does not exhibit. And it's an indicator that a child may be slow to develop some of those skills or be developing very, very quickly. But this is simply an example of a behavior rating scale. Notice we don't ask something broad like, is your child developmentally on level? There's none of those macro level questions. We're literally asking people about specific Observable behaviors. Anyone could fill this out as long as they've been able to see a child in action. So in gifted education, we have a wide body of information about the behaviors that gifted kids typically exhibit in a classroom. And I think the history of this really is that Dr. Joe Renzuli back in the 1970s started looking at that literature. Like, we had all this research about, what are the behaviors that gifted kids in a classroom might exhibit. And he thought, I bet I could pull that together in a little scale. And he actually developed 4 subscales that identified behaviors that a teacher might exhibit. And he created a scale 1 through 5. You could exhibit this behavior not at all. You could exhibit it to a great degree. So his is sort of the kernel of these behavior rating scales. And then from that, we sort of expand out into some of the more specialized rating scales I'm going to talk about. But it all starts back in the 1970s with the research on the behaviors that gifted kids exhibit. So let me give you a couple of examples. Dr. Gail Reiser was the developer of the scales for identifying gifted students. And just as a side, Dr. Gail Reiser is an old friend of mine, and she was my stats professor at Baylor. Kathleen McConnell is her co-author on the SIGs. So let's look at some of the items. There is a subscale for general intellectual ability, and that question might be: the child establishes cause and effect relationships easily, 1 through 5. And the teacher compares the child to his or her peer group to determine the degree to which the child exhibits that behavior in comparison to their peers. A language arts scale: enjoys talking about ideas or feelings generated by what is read or what is read to him or her. Again, it's something a teacher can observe. It's specific behaviors. We're not asking a teacher, is the child gifted or not? We're not asking a child, does this child exhibit gifted behaviors? We're really asking a very discrete, specific question that relates to a domain of talent. Here's a mathematics scale question: easily distinguishes between relevant and irrelevant information in a mathematical problem. Again, to what degree does this child exhibit that when compared to their peers? And finally, in science, can apply a scientific finding from one situation to another. In other words, back to the old education courses, the ability to generalize out a concept to other conclusions. So here's some examples of the kind of behaviors that we look for in a behavior rating scale. Now that we've established what is a behavior rating scale, and I've shown you some examples of what one of these behavior rating scales in gifted looks like, I want to circle back to something that came out of an NAGC task force a couple of years ago. And this is essentially my definition that I'm going to work with for gifted students. Students with gifts and talents students with gifts and talents perform or have the capability to perform at higher levels compared to others of the same age, experience, or environment in one or more domains. There's 2 parts of this definition that I think are really important. One is students with gifts and talents perform at the highest levels. Well, those kids are easy to find because they're typically performing at the highest levels. If we're looking for performance, that's an easy one that we can search for. It's this other group that's a little harder to get a hold of. And that's the ones who have the capability to perform, but are not yet performing at the highest levels. And those are the kids we'd like to tap into if we're going to establish a broad sense of equity in our gifted program. The other piece that I want to mention is this latter piece about the domains. You could be gifted in language arts, but not in mathematics. And so one of the nice things about this, for example, the SIGs that I'm going to talk about, the scales for identifying gifted students that I'll talk about in a minute, is it has subscales for each of the different domains of talent. And that'll allow you to identify kids who are performing at the highest levels or have the potential to perform at the highest levels in a specific domain. And I'm going to, throughout this discussion, I'm going to keep coming back to this definition, because this idea of the kids who have the capability to perform at it, how do we get to those kids, is going to be an important part of our consideration. So this is how the SIGs, the scales for identifying gifted students, gets at this question of the comparison group. Like, in other words, I want to find the kids who are performing at or have the capability to perform at the highest levels when compared to their peers. Well, let's look at how the literature defines peers. So in the SIGs, teachers are asked, to what degree does the student exhibit the behavior listed when compared with his or her grade level peers? And then the instructions further define what a peer is using the research literature. Peers are defined as students of similar age, background, and social status. So what a teacher looks at is the kids who are in the ESL program or have limited English language proficiency. We're going to look for the top performers among those peers. If we have kids coming from poverty, we're going to look for the top performers from the kids who come from poverty. We're going to compare those kids in terms of the behaviors they're exhibiting in the classroom to their peer group. And that's where the power of these behavior observation scales come from. And I want to sort of address the one of the things that I've heard in the past, and I certainly, when I was in the classroom, I heard it, but I hear it from time to time when I've talked to others in gifted land. So we talk about like trying to find these kids who are not traditionally identified for gifted, and I get this pushback a little bit. Well, you just know who the gifted kids are, right? You can just look at a kid and know that they're gifted, or you'd be in a classroom for a couple of weeks and you know who the top performers are, right? Well, I don't think that that's true. I think you probably are able to find some of the top performers, but I also think we miss a lot of kids. And it's one of the reasons that equity can become an issue in gifted education if we come in with our preconceived notions of what a gifted child is. So instead of looking for behaviors that are typical of high performance or the potential for high performance, we start looking for this, and we all know it, we've got it in our head. What is that crystallized notion of what a gifted kid looks like? We've got this definition that exists in our head that this is a gifted kid. We can find that. We know what that kid looks like. The problem with having that crystallized notion in our head and then trying to pursue that crystallized notion is that we can really skew the results of the kind of kid we get in the classroom. So let me show you this next slide. So if I go to Google image search and I look for gifted child, now remember, Google isn't making a statement about anything. Google's just reflecting back what we think a gifted child looks like when we do an image search. Well, there you go. There's the results for gifted child when we do a Google image search. Boy, do those kids look very white. They look very male for the most part. And by the way, let me throw out this idea that it's one of the challenges that we get into when we just have some sort of, blanket referral for gifted services. We ask teachers to refer a child for gifted services. If we do that, we tap into this crystallized notion of what is a gifted child, and the kids that we collect for our program can often look very much like what Google thinks we think the kids look like. And that can definitely create some equity problems for our programs. So let me offer a solution. Let me offer an alternative way of looking for these kids and talk about the strength of the behavior rating scales. So Bruce McCallum and Steve, Steve McCallum and Bruce Bracken start off with this statement: we need a measure sensitive to student diversity. The U.S. public schools are characterized by incredible diversity, and that is increasingly the case. We've got a diversity of race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, languages, and that impacts the kind of kids that we can bring into our program. We ought to have a big, open, equitable identification process. And so, we have a group of people who are the fans of behavior rating scales that are pushing this notion that behavior rating scales are one tool that we can use to create greater equity in our programs. Let me give you an example of what happens when we use a behavior rating scale. This is from the HOPE scale, and these are results that Marcia Gentry and her team come back with when you use the HOPE scale with different populations of students. The thing to notice is, of course, we'll never get perfectly results that are exactly the same, but what we do get is very close. We eliminate a great deal of the variation among the mean scores for each of these populations of kids. This is Marcia's academic subscale. These are mean scores across the academic, and look how little they vary when you get the scores back for a behavior rating scale. Notice the social scale, which includes leadership, ability, creativity, almost no difference. So there will be some variability, but it's greatly reduced when you're using a behavior rating scale. You are establishing a pathway to equity when you're using behavior rating scales as one piece of the puzzle of finding gifted kids. Think of this as a net we're throwing out and trying to find kids that have the potential or are performing at the highest levels. So why use behavior rating scales? Like what is the magic? They're fair. They focus on discrete observable behaviors, not a preconceived notion of that gifted child. Go back to that gifted image or that Google image search that I was talking about. We're not asking teachers to identify the gifted kids in their classroom. We're asking them to rate the degree that they exhibit discrete behaviors. It is equitable that as a result of using this instrument, we're going to achieve equity because we're not comparing kids, for example, to a nationally normed population of kids or some idealized notion of kids. We're asking them to see, do they exhibit this behavior when compared to their peers within the population? It's valid. Teachers are an excellent source of data. They've been in the classroom with the kids. And of course, I mean, we're facing some special challenges right now in some schools that are blended or online learning. But in a traditional setting, the teachers are experiencing the kids ongoing. Now, if you're in an online or blended environment, you're experiencing it in a different way, but you're still able to identify whether or not they're asking, for example, if they're engaged with more difficult reading materials, for example. So even there, I think you've got the teacher is the best source of information for rating these kids. You can also have a situation where parents can rate the kids. The parents are good sources of information. Where parents are a little less accurate than the teachers are, that the parents don't have as much comparison group. They've got maybe the kids, neighborhood group or those kids that they go to gymnastics with and that sort of thing. But the comparison group isn't quite as rich as the teachers are, but it's still there. And the parents can be very good sources of information about whether or not the kids exhibit these behaviors when compared to their peers. The wonderful thing about behavior rating scales is that they are economical. The Hope Scale, for example, each form is $1.50. You could, for $150, if you had a school with 100 kids, you could rate every kid in that classroom. You could do universal screening for a very economical price. And the highest priced form we have is the SIGs at $2.50. So, compared to some of the other instruments out there, this is an incredibly affordable identification tool for schools. So let me talk for a minute about why do other measures, and I'm talking about aptitude measures or achievement measures, why might they miss kids? Well, one is restricted opportunity to learn school-related skills and knowledge. So kids come to our school from poverty, haven't been exposed to the opportunities to learn that other kids have. Well, if we give them an instrument, we assess their achievement gains at grade 3, for example. It's a formula for missing a lot of kids because of their background. They just didn't have the experiences coming into the school, and so they're starting at a deficit, and that's going to take them a while to catch up. Limited exposure to test format and methods of assessing aptitude. Listen, I will tell you a little secret, and I only know this because I can see the analytics on Amazon. The #1 selling product. And I wish we were here today as an audience because I got asked this and I could get some answers, but I'm going to tell you the answer before I add. The #1 selling product on Amazon in the field of gifted isn't a teaching manual, isn't a socio like an SEL product for kids. It's a test prep book for the COGAT, and it's being sold to parents who are preparing their kids to do better on an achievement measure so that they can get into elite programs, particularly in the New York City schools is where we see a cluster of the purchases of this book. And it's not mine, by the way. I don't publish such a thing. What I am saying here is that you have families that are exposing their kids to lots of opportunities to learn They're well-educated, wealthy families. They are taking the time to set aside to teach a kid the format of an aptitude measure. They give a kid practice in how to perform on that aptitude measure. They're buying books that help a child perform better on that aptitude measure. And those kids come into our program, and then we give a big test, and lo and behold, we find out the kids from poverty don't do so well. Well, right. That's one of the reasons that happens, is they just haven't had the kind of exposure that some of the other kids have. Limited English language skills, another one that will ding a kid when it comes to an achievement measure, highly verbal measure. Kids with English language proficiency difficulties, they're going to have their scores depressed. And finally, twice exceptionality, a really bright, gifted child with dyslexia is going to struggle on a measure. I've got one of my kids, my oldest son, who deals with dysgraphia. When he was in school, he was a whiz at math. He's in a pre-engineering program right now. He's a fantastically talented mathematician. He just couldn't write the answers down fast enough, and was incredibly frustrated in the early years because, we had to struggle to get, for accommodations for him. And that's the kind of thing, though, that when you're taking a standardized measure, that a kid who's twice exceptional is won't perform as well on those measures. But I also want to be clear that this doesn't mean that the other instruments are not to be used. There is no single instrument that is, quote, the gifted test. A child with dysgraphia, who I just gave an example of, might perform poorly on a standardized math achievement test, but perform well in her classroom, where the teacher gives her extra time or allows for verbal responses, which is what happened with my son. A child who is an English language learner might not perform well on a standardized verbal aptitude assessment, but her teacher might see her making significant gains in her language arts classroom. That's the teacher that's able to see the kid performing at making more progress than maybe the test could identify for. Here's another. This is a real world example. Another real world example. A child might be scoring in the 99th percentile in math achievement, but because she is an unchallenged and an undifferentiated general education classroom, the teacher would be unable to see her advanced potential. When I was in the school and we were trying to get our gifted program started, we had a kid 99th percentile, well, 98th, 99th, 97th percentile on all the domains of his achievement measure. And he had an IQ score of 133. And his behavior rating scale from the teacher came back like really low across the board. And the teacher's comment at the bottom was, "This is the laziest kid I've taught in 20 years. Well, once the kid got into an appropriate classroom where he was being challenged and where there was a rich learning environment for him, and he could go up as far as he could with the acceleration of the content, he performed just fine. The trouble is he had just turned off in that general ed classroom. Well, so there's an example, though, where a behavior rating scale isn't as good as the achievement measure and the aptitude measure. So what we're looking for is a mix of these tools that we can use to identify kids. So I'm gonna pop over real quickly, if you'll tolerate me. I'm gonna come over to the Proofrock Press website, only because I want to show you some additional resources, particularly one on universal screening. And let me come across here real quick. I had to get another screen share. So here's the Proofrock Press website, and I do want to have everyone's attention to the webinars we've done. Ever since the lockdown, we tried to think of ways that we could help folks out who are sitting at home and trying to provide them some professional learning resources. If you come to that webinar page and come to recordings of past webinars, I want to show you these two. So I've done a shortened version of this behavior rating scale, much more condensed than this one. This one you'll have the pleasure of hearing me for an entire hour. So I've got a little bit of extra information and some demonstrations in here. But more importantly, I have this local norms and universal screening as tools for equitable identification. And this is this talks about universal screening, where we could test everybody and we can establish our own local norms if we want to. I talk about the statistical tools that you'll need to do that. There's also on here, if you get interested in universal screening, there is a white paper that we developed. I can't say that I wrote it, right? But I had so many neat people who helped me with it. Dr. Scott Peters looked at the stats we were using. Dr. Gail Reiser looked at it. Dr. Leila Sanguris, who I'll mention a little bit later, looked at it. So it's a tool that sort of walks you through the process of establishing norms. It comes with the spreadsheet that you need, that if you can export your raw data into the spreadsheet and you can establish those local norms and get your standard scores and percentile ranks for that process. So I would commend this area of our website to you. Let me also note that all of the protocols for the instruments are available on the website. You needn't guess about what the instruments have in them. If we come into the complete scales, you notice the statistical support for these instruments is so profound and so positive that I've gone ahead and just put the examiner manual sections that are about the technical qualities of these instruments online, so you can download the technical quality chapters, read them, and be assured that we have established reliability, validity for the instruments. If you want to see the protocol, simply come over here to the school rating scales, click on that, you get the PDF of the scales. You can see the specific questions that are being asked. There's all of the research that you need to do. You can print this too and take it to other administrators to show if you're considering using the instruments. So let me come back, and I have my camera up here, so I have to kind of lean over to be able to shift back to the presentation. So at this point, I'm going to start talking a little about the specific instruments, but I did want to, sort of mention that at this point we've established what a behavior rating scale is. I've established why we might use them and how they achieve equity, or at least move towards equity. As we noticed in that example I gave, there's still some small group differences, but they're small. And then also I talked about universal screening. We've got too much to cover today for me to go into the universal screening part of this. But boy, with behavior rating scales, that's an economical possibility now that you couldn't have done with some of the other more expensive instruments. I can assess an entire school for $200-300, and I've got all my data there. And with that white paper that I just showed you, pull those into a spreadsheet. You can do the calculations. You can get your standard scores, your percentile ranks for that local population using local norms. So I would, highly suggest that you at least give that a look and listen to that webinar too. Dr. Leila Sanguris out of Baylor University, who's the psychometrician there, and I developed that webinar, and she kind of walks through the technical side of the piece in that webinar. Definitely would recommend that for you guys if you're so inclined. So let me come in here back into my presentation so that I can be a talking head again. I'm going to talk about some of the behavior rating scales that we have at Baylor University. Now, this has been kind of an odyssey for me. In 1993, Dr. Gail Reiser and Kathleen McConnell approached me that they saw that there was this opportunity to do a nationally normed behavior rating scale. So they had thousands of kids in this national norm population. They did all the statistical tools to give us a nationally normed instrument. Marcia Gentry, and I'm going to get to these guys in a little bit, and I'll talk about the origins of these. But Marcia and her team developed the HOPE scale, which is designed specifically for the purpose of eliminating the bias that might be in a behavior. Well, in any instrument, she did a fantastic job of eliminating all cultural and ethnic biases that might come up in the questions. And then finally, Dr. Joe Renzuli, and I mentioned this that in the late 70s he had developed the Scripsis. I call it the Renzuli scales because it's kind of a mouthful to call it the scales for rating the behavioral characteristics of superior students. But he develops that initially with four scales. And then as Joe's conception of what is giftedness and really what is the population, the enrichment triad model expands out, and we start looking at trying to find kids with passions for all kinds of different talent areas, he expands that, the Scripsis out to, he's in his third edition now, and there's lots of talent areas. So I'll talk about that a little bit as well. And please listen, I noticed when I was off the presentation, I haven't got any questions yet, but I sure hope you guys will throw in some questions and task me if you've got some concerns. One thing that does come up, that the Hope Scale and the SIGs are to be used with the general teaching population. And so at no point, it's really important to understand this. At no point do we ask the teacher, and I know I've said this before, I'm going to reiterate, no point do we ask the teacher, does this kid exhibit behaviors typical of a gifted child, for example? If we ask that, we'd have to give the teachers special training in gifted education. They'd have to know what those behaviors are beforehand. We don't do that. We ask specific behaviors that you could observe as a teacher in the classroom. You don't have to have special training in gifted in order to determine whether or not a kid's reading off-level reading materials. That's the kind of question that we're posing. It's not necessary to provide special training for the general population of teachers to do these. And to further reiterate this point, all of the validity studies that have been done, for example, for the SIGs, were done without special training for the teachers. You establish the validity, the comparative to the SIGs and the COGAT, the SIGs and achievement measures, standardized achievement measures, without giving special training. So the SIGs established that validity without that special training. The Hopes did the same thing. Renzuli scale is a little different. We'll have a short training program so that we establish inter-rater reliability with the teachers with that instrument, but it's not onerous. So let me talk about the SIGs. This is kind of the flagship of the behavior rating scales because it is nationally normed. We have 7 areas of talent. So we're going to get some areas like leadership, general intellectual ability. Those are areas that we're going to look for, and creativity. Those are areas that we're going to look for general, those characteristics were typically associated with giftedness. But then we'll also have these domain specific subtests where we can find out, does a kid have a specific proclivity in mathematics or a passion and interest in mathematics? So that's the math subscale. So I'll talk about those subscales in a moment. You can use these from age 5 all the way up through 17 and 11 months. Really important with the SIGs, and it's probably why most schools are so attracted to the SIGs, in addition to the fact that it's normed, is that it has a school rating scale and a home rating scale. So parents or guardians can also evaluate the students. And so when we think about a committee's decision for whether or not a child qualifies for gifted services, we have an opportunity to collect data from the teachers, but we also have the opportunity to collect data from the parents and the caregivers as well. This has an online or paper version. You can choose, and both have their advantages. I'll talk about the differences in just a little bit. And then again, this one's nationally normed, and we're right now, Dr. Todd Kettler and Layla Sangiris are doing the revision to the SIGs, which will be the SIGs 2, which releases. We're gonna soft release it next season with print copies, so you get copies that you can review. To be honest, I think with COVID and everything going on, I've been a little hesitant to try to just switch people over. So what we're going to do is try to keep both the SIGs and the SIGs 2 available for a while as school districts make the transitions and deal with everything that they've been dealing with right now. But I do want to be clear, we do have the SIGs 2 coming out in the spring. Boy, it's a big deal. They've got 15 to 25,000 kids data in each of these subscales. The stats that are supportive of this instrument are rock solid, and a huge database of kids are coming into the scoring information that we've got. So I'm pretty excited about that, and I know that Dr. Sangiris and Dr. Kettler are excited about it too. And if you do, there's a corner chat. For the Proofrock Press that I did, that I interviewed Todd about the information they're getting back from this norm. So if you go to the Prufrock Press exhibit, the exhibitor listing, there's a corner chat listed there. I'd invite you to come join us for that and listen to that corner chat, because we'll talk about some of the findings they have. But again, the findings are fantastic. Like, we're finding, even with those huge bodies of data, very little difference, little difference between the populations, but very little difference. And I think this is such a powerful tool, and I'm so glad that we're able to come out with this new norm. So here's the data we're going to get from SIGs. We've got the domain areas of language arts, mathematics, science, and social studies. So we're going to find kids who have or exhibit, perform at, or have the potential to perform at the highest levels in those areas. And then we also look at general intellectual ability. This is more like aptitude, creativity, and leadership. So one thing I would make a note of as you're thinking about this instrument, you wouldn't use all of these subscales. If your program is let's say we focus on language arts and math, we might give the general intellectual ability, we might give the language arts, we might do the mathematics scale. If we don't service leadership, if we don't service creativity as part of our mission in our gifted program, there's no reason to have the teachers fill out all of these forms. And by the way, I want to be clear, they're not onerous. There's maybe 12 items. And with the 6.2, there'll even be slightly fewer items with each of these subscales. You can finish these things very quickly as a teacher. But if we don't want to add more work to teachers who are already dealing with an awful lot of work, I think the best we can do for them is to pick the areas where our program's mission serves the kids, and only identify in those areas. Let me talk a little bit about the Hope Scale. So the Hope Scale was developed as part of a Jack Kent Cooke Foundation grant up at Purdue University. You can see that the principals on that are Marcia Gentry, Scott Peters, and the editor and others. And then the editor on that piece is Matt Fugate, who's also done a wonderful new book just recently on twice exceptional learners as well. So these are all fine folks who've developed the Hope Scale, and their purpose in developing this was to identify an equitable instrument. And as a result of this process, they really, the team developed this instruction to the teachers. As a rater, it is important that you rate each of your students compared to other children of similar in age, background, experience, culture, and or environment. So they get even really more specific and detailed about what constitutes, in their opinion, a peer group. And as a result, you saw that stat that I gave you earlier, very little differences in the scores among the different populations of kids as a result of using this. So they've got two different kinds of information that comes back. One is their academic subscale, and then they've got a social subscale. So when you think of academic, you think about, schoolhouse knowledge, creativity that would apply into the school. So you'll see questions like performs or shows the potential to perform at markedly higher levels or high levels. To tap into the creativity, you think the kids who think outside the box. But think about gifted kids that you've known. Exhibits intellectual intensity, has intense interests. Like you've got a kid who's really interested in mathematics. Sometimes at the giving up some of the other subject areas because the kid's so interested. I mean, what a sign of somebody who's got a real passion for an area of interest. So the Hope Scale picks that up. Then you've got some social, the social subscale. So here you're going to find some of those things like I think about self-awareness, like some of the executive function things that have to do with like how you perceive yourself in relationship to others and how you can lead others. So again, tapping into some of the characteristics of gifted kids. I would note that one of the things that the SIGS does that the Hope Scale does not do, the SIGS will give you those domain-specific aptitude information. The Hope doesn't. So the Hope's intent is to throw a wide net, find the kids who have the potential for performance or who are performing at, and then you can sort through, their specific area of talent development and the areas where you're going to slot them in. The SIGS tries to give you a little bit more accurate information about that. I want to be clear, the Hope Scale is not a normed instrument. Marcia and her team want you to do local norms. They don't want a kid in, a small town in Arkansas to be compared to, kids in, in top performing schools in New York City. That's not like what that's data they don't need. What they need is, how does this kid perform in comparison to his or her peers in that school? So finally, an instrument that I love, it's not nationally normed. It's a little different than the Hope Scale because we're going to get an expansive amount of data about kids and their passions. This is the Renzuli scales. We've got 14 areas of emergent talent and ability that we could look for. Again, if we don't serve all those areas, I wouldn't give the subscales for all of these areas. We want to only give it where we have kids who, we can serve. 5 through 18, 40 years in the schools. When I was a teacher, in 1987, this instrument in its original form was being used in my school for identification purposes. Again, now this is in its 3rd edition, so it's a much more expanded, and the data that supports it is much more expansive, but this has been around for a long time. We have an online and paper version. We have local norms and rankings. So and that is opposed to the national norms. We're going to be doing the local norms, and ranking is the way that we get the reports back. So let's look at the ones that started in the late 70s and the 80s. These are the commonly used ones for programs that were back in the day. We look at learning, which very much ties into aptitude, creativity, motivation, and leadership. But then watch what Dr. Renzuli does with his additional talent areas. So we can now identify for musical ability, artistic ability, dramatics, even planning. And think about that, like a kid who has you would rate very highly on ability to plan is also likely to be someone who's functioning at a high executive level. So, we're getting some like information we wouldn't have gotten with some of the other scales: communication skills, math, reading, technology, science. So we get this broad spectrum of where our kids' talents or passions might be. And it's a wonderful tool, especially given Dr. Renzuli's philosophy of talent development and enrichment opportunities for kids, because it tells us where we can provide some opportunities for our students. I would give you an example, because I love this kid, and might have been one myself when I was in elementary school. Dramatics, volunteers to participate in classroom plays and skits, easily tells a story or gives an account of some experience, is adept at role playing, improvising, acting out situations on the spot, and commands and holds the attention of a group when speaking. You know those kids in your classroom, and they are kids who have a proclivity for dramatics, a passion for dramatics. And so if we have a program, if we're servicing kids in this area, if we want to find kids where we can provide some enrichment opportunities, this is a great tool for identifying kids that may not know that's going to be something that they have a flair for. Dr. Renzuli also developed a scale for parents. It's called The Things My Child Likes to Do. And again, you got to go back to Dr. Renzuli's philosophy. He's looking for kids with a passion for a thing. We want to find those passions and then build out from there, give kids opportunities to explore those passions. Well, so the parents are a good source of information about whether a child exhibits passions for different topics. So the Things My Child Likes to Do is an instrument that he developed in the last couple of years, and it gives schools a nice tool for finding the passions that kids have. And here's an example. This is how he structures it for parents, and he's much more thoughtful about it. So he gives the behavior. My child enjoys challenging puzzles, games, and other problems that require complex thinking more than other children his or her age. But then Dr. Renzuli goes through and gives an example. This is what it would look like in the home. Leanne solves the Sudoku puzzle in the newspaper for fun every day. Devin prefers games that require strategy to those that rely on luck. So first the behavior, but then an example for the parent that's more concrete. How would this look like in your home? So now I'm going to shift over in the last 7 minutes or so and talk about the online piece. So we have these as paper forms. That's how they all started. You buy the book, the pack of books and that sort of thing. But these are also available online. And of course, as you can imagine, under COVID, the demand for the online piece has been rather large for us. And we've been helping schools get set up with the online piece. All of the instruments that I've talked about today have an online component. So the online pieces can be completed anytime, anywhere. You can import all your student data and export all your student data. And you can also get the scores out too. So if you want to upload that into your student information system, you can do that as well. It does all your calculations for you. So when you think about it, in my opinion, like the paper forms are fast. If you're just going to pass them out to your teachers, here's, Miss Jones, here's 5 forms. I need you to complete it for these 5 students. That's a fairly easy task. Then you've got to go back and collect those forms. Then you've got to do the scoring. And that's not an automatic thing. I mean, we're looking at, we're focused on being economical. So the school does the scoring of these instruments, but it's just a matter of counting up the scores. The online system does that all for you. So the online system is probably a little more time consuming in the setup because you've got to upload the student information, do the student assignments, but it's way faster on the back end because it's done all the collection for you and does all the calculations for you. No paper forms to collect or manage. Secure data retention. Everything we do is on Amazon S3 servers, fully secured. And we can, in the case of the Hope scale and the Renzuli scales, we can do the calculations needed. I mentioned earlier that spreadsheet that you could download with the white paper. If you don't want to do that, you could just, the Renzuli scale and the Hope scales both have a local norms calculation module. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you over to a video clip, and I'm going to, again, kind of dodge out of the screen here and find this video, and I'll walk you through this. And this is the SIGs, the online SIGs. And I wanted to show you kind of how the different components of how this works. And I'll try to talk you through, like, as we're looking at this, how it works. So in this example, I've got 2 schools, and I can have as many schools as I want to. Billing for this relates to student seats, has nothing to do with assignments or the schools. So I've got 2 schools here. If I click over to the user accounts, you'll see that I've got approximately, I've got 1 teacher who's assigned to 2 different schools. SIGS allows for that. And then also I've got just a teacher who's assigned to a particular school. Students, I've got 3 students that I've uploaded here. Now, one of them already has a completed scale. I can upload all of my student data if I want to using a spreadsheet, or I can enter it by hand, but honestly, mostly you would do this to add a couple of students if you forgot them on the spreadsheet or something like that. Mostly you'd want to do, spreadsheet uploads. I'm going to show you how to do this in a minute, but from here, this tab, we would do the student assignments. So everything's managed in this console very, very easily. I'm going to show you what these reports look like later, but I just wanted to show you that you can do a full school summary report showing all students. You can do the student forms so that you can put those in folders if you keep physical copies of student forms from the print student summary report tab. You can also see which teachers haven't sent in their reports and that sort of thing. So you can keep tabs. Do you need to send a tickler to somebody about, go ahead and finish that scale. So we get status reports of our scales. And then also, if I want to upload my data into a student information system, I can do that here. I can just export a CSV file from the SIGS, the online SIGS system. There's always readily available the licensing information, how many seats do I have left, and then we can also, the administrative options are basically, how long do I want to give a teacher before the system automatically sends a reminder email out to that teacher. So let me come over here to the assignments, and I'm going to show you how to do an assignment. Click on Tammy Fisher. Miss Fisher is our teacher that we're going to be using. We're going to move Katie McDowell over into her area. I could move all of them at one time, but in this case, I know that I want Katie to be assessed. I can also remove assignments if I want to from this screen. And then I come down to the little red thing button there and I click it. And this is how I assign scales. I'm going to click there, 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 and there. And that's as easy as it is. I've now assigned that teacher those scales. I can also do the home scales here. We don't allow parent accounts, but you can collect the data from a parent and enter it into the system, and it'll do the calculation of the scores and the percentile ranks if you want to use the online system for that. So and that's no cost. The paper form is you have to purchase, but entering into the system is not. So through the magic of time, I've now got 3 completed student scores, and I want to show you how the reports work now. So if I want to go to North Windsor, this is what a report, I have those 3 students. I'm going to run this report for North Windsor. I've got all the scores here, both the raw score, the standard score, and the percentile ranks. So that's the whole score. If I had 300 students, that would be reflected on this report. Let me get back over to the student summary report. Now this is for if you keep, in folders, you've got physical copies of student reports. That's here. We could print this. Right now it's just showing up the browser, but we could print this. This is what you would have if you filled out a summary report and put it into the students folder. So everything's available there for you if you still keep paper records. And then also just to show you that export of student ratings that can be uploaded into your student information system. Let me show you what a teacher sees. They get an email and it just says you've got a scale waiting, and the teacher clicks that. Comes in and they're going to log into the system using their school email address. And what they're presented with when they come in is the scale that's not yet started. Click on that, and it'll bring up the scale. So notice the ease here that like all the teacher needs to do is click the different boxes, and there. That's all there is to it. Once we get that, oh, by the way, we can collect some qualitative data too in this box. So we can ask teachers, hey, if you give much more, 6 or more times, give us some examples of the students so that the committee can look at those examples. So it does allow us to collect some qualitative data as well as quantitative data about the students using this form. So we can submit the scores, cancel without saving, or save and finish later. I'm going to save and finish later here. Okay, so I'm gonna switch back and I'm gonna look at Q&A, and I've got one. Cecilia asked, I may have missed it. Did you already mention when or how this assessment is given to students? So what we recommend is that the teachers need to have been with the kids for at least a couple of months. What I see typically with school districts is they start some assessments in late October, November, because obviously the teachers are the source of the information for that. We want to give them enough time with the kids so that they can see what the kids are doing in comparison to their peers. Likewise, I also see a lot more assessment being done after January, after you've had the teachers with the kids for one semester. I would say that I'm kind of done in terms of the presentation. So please throw out any questions that you might have. Let's see, I've got Crystal. Sorry, I'm looking at Q&A, and my friend Colin Seal, if you get a chance to listen to him at the session, I've noticed he is able to like juggle the Q&A and the chat all at the same time, and then also be typing answers to people. I can like look at one section at a time. So I just realized that I had a question in the chat section. So Crystal says, quick clarification, if I am seeking to utilize this scale in 3rd grade for GT programming in 4th grade, it's best to have the 3rd grade teachers complete the scale on all the students. Yeah, because what you want is the teacher, and this goes back to Cecilia's question, you want to go back to the teachers who've been in the classroom with that kid for a period of time and can see how they're performing in comparison to their peer group. You're welcome. Any other questions that I can address? I'd like to be able to do that. I do want to I'll share with you a concern that I have here at the end. And it is in Texas last year, we had a special deal in Texas where gifted education had a funding allotment, and it was a specific amount of money that would go to gifted kids specifically. In the last legislative session, due to a group that had lobbied against gifted education, we lost that allotment. Now that money went back into the general education fund, and then the legislature required that schools and school districts do serve gifted kids. But we lost our designated allotment. It went into the general education program. And so it was a ding for us. The group that was lobbying so heavily against gifted was a group called the Equity Center. And I think that something that we are going to have to grapple with as we move into this time of racial justice, of an awakening of inequity, both culturally and in schools. I think having tools like this that essentially do not show great differences in terms of results, but when you compare different groups of kids, gives us a powerful instrument that allows us to try to move our programs to greater equity. So I just wanted to throw that out. It's been a concern of mine, and I think having these kind of tools that are equitable, or at least more equitable, it gives us something powerful that we can wield. What is your recommendation for minimum sample size for applying local norms? That's a great question, and I don't have a perfect example. I will tell you that I have a fact sheet on the website. Let me see if I can't. I don't want to derail the presentation, but let me come over here and kind of get over to the Proofrock Press website. Oop. See, look at me. Let me try this again. I wanted to be able to show you the, here it is. I prepared a local norms instruction sheet that is available. If you purchase the materials, there's a link to this, and I walk you through the whole process of establishing the local norms, and it talks about the size that you want to, but that's definitely always a, it's an art as opposed to a science. You want a large enough and distributed enough sample of your local population to establish the local norms. Ideally, you'd use everybody, but for example, Dr. Renzuli recommends doing something like taking a random listing of all the kids in the school. Let's say you've got 700 kids, then take every 8th kid and test every 8th kid. That becomes your sort of potentially representative sample of the population. The larger it can be, the better. But there is no like hard and fast rule. You just have to have enough kids that you can believe that you've got a normal distribution within that population. And that, again, a bit of an art versus a science, but the larger the better, I would say. Okay. That is, we're kind of running down time. I'm at 1:57, and I want to make sure that I catch everybody. I see, I told you about Colin being so good at this. I hadn't been scrolling down, so let's see. Oh, that's Deanna telling us 3 minutes left. So I tell you what, if you guys don't have any more questions, let me show this this last screen. And again, I wish I didn't have to bow out of the screen every time I show my slide, but I set up my camera funny. This is my contact information. You guys are always welcome to email me, but trust me, I'm not the psychometrician on this, as you probably could tell throughout this. If you email me with specific questions about the psychometric qualities, or if you have some, would like some help with doing local norms or using the instruments, very likely I will send you on to those scholars that I mentioned to begin with, Dr. Reiser, Marcia Gentry, Dr. Renzuli. I'll be gathering those guys. They are the experts. They're the scholars in this. As I said initially, I'm just their proxy here today to talk about their instruments. But feel free to email me, and then I can direct your questions to the right folks. Okay, so That's it for my time. I genuinely appreciate you guys sitting through this hour of my head talking, and I hope you have a wonderful conference. I hope you will all stay safe and stay healthy, and have a great day. Thank you so much.